Miami versus Ohio State. They came into this game as 9.5-point underdogs in this one, and they got the job done. The Hurricanes prevailed in the Cotton Bowl over Ohio State 24-14. Not a lot of people gave them a chance in this one. Ohio State is the defending national champions, and people thought that they would just steamroll right over Miami, but that was not the case. Miami's defense was ferocious all night, as evidenced by their first round matchup against Texas A&M, where they won 10-7 in that defensive battle in that game. And running back Mark Fletcher Jr. for Miami, he pretty much had them on the ropes at the beginning because he fumbled early on at the Ohio State 19-yard line. And fortunately for them, they forced a punt after that, and then he ended up catching a touchdown to make it 7-0 Miami early on. And the first play after that, Julian Sayin, the quarterback for Ohio State, completed a 59-yard pass to Jeremiah Smith, and they got them all the way down to the Miami 25-yard line. But unfortunately, he ended up taking a sack for a 6-yard loss, and then the next play, he threw a pick six that was returned 72 yards by Keontae Scott of Miami to go up 14-0. So they found themselves in a hole pretty early on in this one. But Ohio State, they tried to get on the board. They ran the 2-minute drill near the end of the first half, but unfortunately they missed a 49-yard field goal, and they went into halftime down 14. Ohio State, they regrouped at halftime and ended up responding out of the gates in the second half because they led a touchdown drive by running back Bo Jackson. Not that Bo Jackson, but he's also named Bo Jackson. And that made it 14-7. Miami added a field goal onto that to make it 17-7. So still very much within the grasp of Ohio State. It's only a 2-score game. And then the next possession, they led a touchdown drive where Julian Sayin found Jeremiah Smith again, this time for a 14-yard touchdown to make it 17-14. Now, things are pretty interesting now. You're only within a field goal. And after that, they pretty much stalled out the rest of the game, unfortunately, because their defense, they did make plays when they needed to, but the offense just couldn't get things done because they forced a Miami punt, and Ohio State got the ball back with 10 minutes left in the fourth quarter. So a whole lot of football left to be played in this one where they could have taken advantage of their opportunities. But unfortunately, a holding call and a tackle for loss made it 4th and 22, and they were forced to punt after forcing a Miami punt. But then once Miami got the ball back from Ohio State, they did not look back because they scored another touchdown, this time with a drive capped off by Shamar Brown to make it 24-14, and that would end up being the final score because when 55 seconds left, Ohio State got the ball back. It would take a Herculean miracle effort here if for them to have pulled that off within a minute when they had to score 2 times, get the onside kick and everything. But to put the cherry on top for Miami's defense, they picked off Julian Sayin for a second time to essentially end the game. And Miami held on to win 24-14, and they are going to advance to face Ole Miss in the Fiesta Bowl for the college football playoff semifinal game. And if you saw the previous edition of our show on Wednesday where we previewed the games and I made my predictions and everything, I kept stressing that Miami's defense and specifically their pass rush is the best in the country. And that showed in that game against Ohio State. They were just absolutely dominant throughout the entire game, and that's a huge reason why they advanced past Texas A&M and now are going to the semifinals. They are 1 win away from making it back to the national championship. So a little bit of context, their last national title was in 2001. If you talk about some of the greatest college football teams of all time, their name gets thrown in there all the time. They are absolutely in the debate, if not top 3. But that is a return to glory if they can make it past Ole Miss, who had a very dominant performance against Georgia, which we'll get into a little bit. That was the last game of the quarterfinals, and that was an absolute thriller. But unfortunately, the other 2 games were snooze fest, if I'm being honest. And that's putting it generously. And one of those with the first game of the day yesterday being Oregon versus Texas Tech. Now, these are Oregon was number 5 and Texas Tech was number 4. So you expected a very, very competitive game. The spread was only 2.5. They were only 2.5-point favorites in this one. So sportsbooks in Las Vegas, they expected a very, very closely contested game. It was not that. It was all Oregon all the way. They ended up winning 23-0 in this one. Texas Tech, which was second in the country in scoring, couldn't do anything against this Oregon defense, which might have shocked a good bit of people, given how elite they performed in that game. We all knew how good their offense was with quarterback Dante Moore. We knew that they would put up points, although it would have been a tough test for them against this Texas Tech defense, which is among the top 5 in the country. But they did what they needed to do. It wasn't this 45-point outing or 50-point outing like they did against James Madison in the first round. But the offense did what they needed to do. Unfortunately for Texas Tech, their defense, they did make some plays early, but their offense at the end of the day ended up letting them down. They were only down 3-0 at the start of the game thanks to an Oregon field goal, and then they forced a turnover on downs at the Texas Tech 23-yard line. They really just couldn't get out of their way after that on offense because their next few possessions go in this order. They threw an interception, they had a missed field goal, and then they fumbled the ball. So you can't just give away those opportunities to Oregon, and especially in a game where you need to put up points against this team if you want to be competitive and stay in it. Because the defense, like I said, they did their job. They showed up to play. They made plays when they needed to. But they could only be out there for so long. They were pretty much on the field all day. They were probably so exhausted, and that's why they ended up giving up 23 points. And you really just can't ask for much more of them. It's out of their control at that point because the offense was not doing them any favors. But at halftime, it was only 6-0 Oregon, thanks to a couple of field goals for them. So again, they're still very much in this game. The defense is trying their best to keep them in this game. But unfortunately, Texas Tech did end up punting to start the second half, and they on the defensive side of the ball, again, they're continuing to make plays because they forced a turnover on downs at the Texas Tech 33-yard line. But unfortunately, on the next ensuing possession, their quarterback, Baron Morton for Texas Tech, suffered a sack fumble at the Texas Tech 6-yard line, and that was easy work at that point for Oregon, where they just ran it in with running back Jordan Davidson for 6-yard touchdown to make it 13-0. So all of a sudden, you're down 2 scores after being down 6-0 at halftime. It's less of a manageable lead to deal with, and you have to ask more of your offense, which was already struggling. But Texas Tech, again, turned it over on downs on 4th and 1 at the Oregon 34-yard line. Just when you thought they were about to score, they were well within field goal range, but they just could not convert on 4th down. And defensively, again, they continue to make plays because they came up with an interception of quarterback Dante Moore of Oregon at the Texas Tech 37-yard line. So they were in Texas Tech territory, and they held their own. They bent but did not break, and they got the ball back. But again, it just goes back to the mistakes that the offense was making because Texas Tech, they put together their best drive of the day. It was 3rd and goal. You would think they would at least get a field goal out of this, but unfortunately, Baron Morton threw his second interception of the day inside the 10, and inside the end zone, and an Oregon field goal tacked on another 3 points to make it 16-0, and then Texas Tech again turned it over on downs. Oregon missed a field goal, and then they turned it over on downs again. And Oregon was at the Texas Tech 28-yard line, and Davidson again broke off for a touchdown run and capped off another touchdown drive for Oregon to make it 23-0. And that was the final score. Again, it really is unfortunate to see Texas Tech go out like that. They were conference champions in the Big 12. They had such a dominant performance against BYU offensively and defensively. At least they put up a good bit amount of points in that BYU game, but they could not get on the scoreboard in this one. It was a very, very long day for them, unfortunately. And Oregon, on the other hand, they are going to face Indiana in the Peach Bowl, which looked extremely dominant against Alabama in the Rose Bowl, which is our next game that we will be recapping here, where they faced Alabama, who was number 9. There's a lot of controversy surrounding selection process with them because they were the only 3-loss team in the college football playoff. But they said beforehand, the committee said that they would not be punished for losing their conference championship game, which, again, you're kind of rewriting the criteria that we need for the selection process. A lot of people were arguing that Notre Dame should have been in, which after Alabama's performance, I tend to agree with, because Alabama has not looked the part of a playoff team for the last month or 2 months. And that was pretty evident yesterday in the Rose Bowl against Indiana, because they were absolutely dominating them on both sides of the ball. Indiana is still undefeated. They improved to 14-0 and are now the Rose Bowl champions with a 38-3 victory over Alabama. Just it wasn't even close throughout the entire game, and the scoreboard does reflect that. Although Indiana, they didn't start pouring things on until a little bit later into the game, because the first quarter was pretty scoreless. It was 0-0 after 1. But then at the very start of the second quarter, Indiana tacked on a field goal to get things going offensively to make it 3-0. But Alabama, they couldn't really get out of their own way either, because on 4th and 1 on their own 34-yard line, they went for it and did not get it, which put Indiana into prime position to score the game's first touchdown with a 21-yard pass from Heisman Trophy winner and quarterback Fernando Mendoza to Charlie Becker to make it 10-0 Indiana early on. And then Bama, they found themselves at midfield again, but on 3rd down, Ty Simpson, their quarterback, ran for the first down. He ended up getting it, but for some reason, and this boggled my mind whenever I watched it live, he got the first down, but then didn't go straight down. Like, he just stood up still holding the ball. And unfortunately, he ended up fumbling that ball. If he would have went down or at least slid or dove for it, just immediately got down after you got the first down, that wouldn't have been an issue. But unfortunately, they ended up turning the ball over from that. And then Indiana made quick work of that, finding Omar Cooper Jr. for the touchdown to make it 17-0 at halftime. And it was pretty much all downhill after that for Alabama. When it rains, it pours, as people say. But because in the second half, Indiana opened things up with 4 straight touchdown drives. And after that, there was pretty much the nail in the coffin for Alabama. And the first of which was a Mendoza 24-yard touchdown to Elijah Surratt to make it 24-0. And then Bama finally gets on the board with a field goal, which at that point in the game, what does it even matter? You're down 24-3. It's still a 3-score game. What is the point of that? But I guess it's just a moral victory, I guess. I don't know. But head coach Kalen DeBoer, a lot of people are calling for his head for Alabama fans, and they'll probably end up running him out of town. A lot of people on message boards and stuff were saying, leave him on the tarmac and stuff like that. So it'd be interesting to see how the hot seat for him impacts their coaching search moving forward if they do decide to move on from him. But Mendoza, in this game, that was his 3rd passing touchdown of the game. And this was crazy to me because he completed 14 of 16 of his passes, meaning he had more touchdown passes than he did passing incompletions, which is extremely rare. And it's just crazy how efficient they were. He really didn't have to do a whole lot because he was just taking what the defense was giving him, and he absolutely diced them up whenever he did drop back to pass. But running back Kalen Black ended up capping the things off with a 25-yard touchdown to make it 31-3 before Roman Hemby ran it in himself for another 1-yard touchdown to make it 38-3 at the end of the day. It was just purely outclassed domination all day long for Indiana, and they are headed to the Peach Bowl to face Oregon, who we previously mentioned. This is going to be another defensive battle, in my opinion. Don't expect a whole lot of points in this one, although Oregon can score them in bunches. I think their offense is a little bit better, but Indiana, as you just heard, is a lot more efficient when it comes to running the ball and passing the ball. I mean, they had the Heisman Trophy winner, like I said, Fernando Mendoza, and I think that if anybody can win them the game when they need it, I think it is him. He's made plenty of clutch plays all season long, so I'm very, very interested and looking forward to that matchup in the Peach Bowl. But with the Sugar Bowl last night, we had Ole Miss against Georgia. Now, this one was an absolute thriller. If you didn't see it, I feel really sorry for you because this was an incredible game throughout. It was very back and forth, especially early on, where Ole Miss got things going with 2 field goals to make it 6-0. But then Gunnar Stockton for Georgia, their quarterback, ended up running it himself on this absolutely nasty pump fake. I don't know if y'all saw it live, but it was incredible how he faked out. It even faked out the cameraman, and he ended up running it himself for a 12-yard touchdown to give them the lead 7-6. But then DeZon Stribling ended up catching a 39-yard pass from Trinidad Chambliss, the Ole Miss quarterback, who was the MVP of this game. He was absolutely made a name for himself in this one. If you weren't a believer before yesterday, you probably are now. He is the real deal. Doing this against Georgia, putting up over 400 yards against this vaunted Georgia defense is nothing short of spectacular. And then that reception ended up setting up Trinidad to Luke Hands for a 3-yard touchdown. And then they ended up failing the 2-point conversion to make it 12-7. So it was a really odd score. But then Gunnar Stockton for Georgia ended up scoring again himself to make it 14-12. So again, a lot of that back and forth in the first half. But then Kewan Lacey, their running back for Ole Miss, he ended up fumbling the ball, and it was returned 47 yards for a touchdown by Dalen Everett of Georgia to make it 21-12 at half. So just when Ole Miss thought they were still, pretty close in this game, it was only a 2-point deficit. It is now a 9-point deficit, and that was very, very quickly that all unfolded. A lot of people thought the play was dead, but it was not, and it was recovered by Georgia for the touchdown right before the half. And then Ole Miss found themselves at midfield with a 4th-and-1 situation, and they did not convert and turned it over on downs. And this set up Georgia for a field goal attempt, which they end up missing, given it was 55 yards. So it was a bomb for a college kicker. So I don't blame them for missing this one. But for Ole Miss, Harrison Wallace III was incredible in this game, and one of the explosive plays that he made was a 36-yard reception from Chambliss, and then this set up Kewan Lacey for a 7-yard touchdown run to make it 21-19. So they're fighting back in this one. Georgia does add a field goal to make it 24-19. So Ole Miss is continuing to try to keep up and stay in this game and not let it get out of hand. And then Wallace, again, comes up with a 44-yard catch, and this sets up another Lacey touchdown. And they do get the 2-point conversion to, you guessed it, Wallace again. And this makes it 27-24 Ole Miss. They grab a late lead. And then, unfortunately, for Georgia, they ended up getting they ended up getting a strip sack at the Georgia 23-yard line. And this sets up Wallace again for another huge play with a 13-yard touchdown to make it 34-24. And Wallace in this game, he had 9 catches for 156 yards and a touchdown. So he was spectacular in this one. And then wide receiver Zachariah Branch for Georgia ended up catching a touchdown of his own for 18 yards to make it 34-31. So they were right back in this game. They ended up forcing a punt, but then Georgia has themselves 1st and goal at the Mississippi 8 and then settles for a field goal. So they really could have scored a touchdown to give themselves a 4-point lead instead of tying things up at 34. So they really could have taken over this game and potentially won the game if they did not settle for this field goal. But Ole Miss, Trinidad Chambliss came in super clutch because they found themselves at 3rd and 5 and then at the Mississippi 30-yard line. But then DeZon Stribling ends up catching a 40-yard pass from Chambliss to give themselves the first down and set them up for the game-winning field goal by Lucas Carnero, who hits a 47-yard field goal to win 37-34. There was a little bit of extracurricular antics at the end of the game because there were a couple seconds left. And on the kickoff to Georgia, they end up trying this trick play where they lateral it behind, and it ended up going out of bounds and hitting the pylon. So that was counted as a safety for Ole Miss to put them up 39-34, which was the final score. But because of that safety, they had to kick a free kick essentially to Ole Miss. And there was a lot of trouble at the end because all the post-game ceremony and the stage guys that were already on the field, they had to take all of that off, bring all of that to the sideline. It was just a cluster at the end, but it finally ended up ending, and then Ole Miss hung on 39-34 in this one. And they will face Miami in the Fiesta Bowl, and that will be a very, very interesting matchup because I think Miami right now, they're probably the best defense remaining, if not Oregon. And their offense, as you've seen, can put up points in bunches thanks to Trinidad Chambliss, who is playing like a superstar right now. So him against that pass rush will be very interesting to see. I just hope that he can handle that pressure and come away with a victory because whoever wins that game is going to the national championship. I'm sure they all want it more than anything. But with Ole Miss, there are a lot of questions right now because I believe 6 members of their current staff that helped them coach in last night's game are signed with LSU to work on their staff next year. And especially with the transfer portal opening today, it's going to be interesting to see how they kind of live that double life of helping prepare for a semifinal game, but also looking ahead to LSU's offseason and trying to recruit players to Baton Rouge.